Welcome back, folks. Here's a video I'm going to try to make a graphical argument in. In the last video, we looked at the different ways we could describe the height of a sinusoid, the width of a sinusoid, and how far we shifted it. And I introduced those, but we might not have a good feel for what they are yet. Here's a video that I hope is going to help that. And we're going to do this with some animations to try to piece the concepts together for you. Okay, so let's see. Let's get some stuff up here. We've been talking about complex numbers, and we're going to use complex numbers to represent those sinusoids. Okay, and we can talk about them as something called phasors. Okay, and the phasor is very similar to a vector. We represent the sinusoid using a vector, but then we allow that vector to spin, and in allowing that vector to spin, we can reconstruct the sinusoid in the time domain. So it's really kind of a neat thing to see, and hopefully it'll give you some comfort that this isn't coming out of the blue. Okay, that there is actually a relationship between a function maybe like this one, 4 cosine 2 pi t, and with a phase shift of 0, and its phasor representation. So we go through the phasor transform, and we might get something that looks like this. So we take the amplitude 4, okay, and we take the phase shift of 0, just like that. Okay, and I think we talked about that in the previous video. And we lost our angular frequency, right? But we can think of this as having an amplitude of 4, and that's going to be in volts. Okay, the amplitude always gets the unit. It has an angular frequency of 2 pi, that's in radians per second, and it has a phase angle, theta, and in this case it's 0. Okay, we're not shifting this one yet, and that one's going to be in degrees in this case. Could be in radians. Okay, luckily 0 degrees is also 0 radians. Okay, we know how to represent this on a complex plane. We've done that before. It's just going to be a vector laying along the real axis. So let's plot some of this out. Okay, I'm going to try to slide over here so it all shows up above me. But I have a MATLAB script, and with any luck, it's going to work the first time. Okay, and we can take that 4 at an angle of 0, and we can plot it. And it's going to look like this. It has an amplitude of 4. Okay, so we talked about the amplitude for phasors being the peak value. So this is a voltage peak value. So it goes up to 4, and it goes down to -4. Okay, so the peak value is from 0 to 4 there. And it's not shifted. I said the shift is 0 degrees. And we can see that this cosine starts at its positive peak, and that's where we would expect a cosine to start. Okay, cosine of 0 is 1. Multiply that by the amplitude 4, and we're up here at the positive peak. In this case, it's 4. Now, those two pieces of information are evident in the phasor representation, right? We have 4 at an angle of 0. What isn't evident in the phasor representation is the frequency. I said this is 2 pi radians per second. Okay, we're going to take that 4 at an angle of 0, and we're going to let it spin. Okay, and we're going to go through 2 pi radians in 1 second. And 2 pi radians is 1 complete cycle, right? So that phasor is going to rotate once in 1 second. And what we see is we get 1 repetition of the cosine in 1 second if we're looking at the time scale down here on the horizontal axis. Okay, so let's see this in action. What we're interested in here is taking this cosine and representing it in the phasor form, okay, which that phasor form is going to look like this: 4 at an angle of 0. Okay, and it's just going to be a vector that starts at the origin and goes out to 4, and it's got an angle of 0, so it's lying right along the real axis. If we take this vector and we let it spin, it's going to spin at a speed of 2 pi radians per second. And we're interested in the distance from the tip of the vector as it spins to the imaginary axis. So I'm interested in this distance, okay? And it's going to spin. And as it comes up here, I'm interested in the distance from the tip to the imaginary axis. Okay, so it's the horizontal distance away from that vertical, regardless of where it is vertically. Okay, so if we do that, let's set this thing spinning. Okay, some magic happens, and I really enjoy this. Okay, we're going to let it spin 2 pi radians per second. I let it go through 2 full revolutions, but it would really just keep going on and on and on. All right, what might help us is if we don't think about it as a line, okay, as a vector that connects, but we just think about it as some point floating in space, okay, and that's going to rotate around, okay, just without the line, just like it did before. Okay, now if we want to recreate the time domain sinusoid, we need to keep track of where this point is in space over a period of time. So the easiest way to do that is to simply make an axis. And I'm going to make an axis go into the screen here, and it's going to be the time axis. So it's going to plot a little differently, okay? And we'll get a little perspective as I move to this next view. But we're still going to watch that point go around and around, okay? It's just going to kind of corkscrew up the time axis. So here it goes. Here's the corkscrew up the time axis. Okay, we still have a real axis and an imaginary axis, but now along here we have a time axis. Okay, here comes the magic, in my opinion. Let's see here. What do I want to do? This one. Okay, as it corkscrews up the time axis, we're going to have it leave like a smoke trail, like a plane doing skywriting. Okay, it's just going to keep track of where it is. Okay, so we run it, and we get this corkscrew. And some pretty cool things happen when we get this corkscrew. And I'm going to take it and spin it around with my mouse, and we can see a couple things. Okay, if I try to look at the complex plane, it looks a little different because the real axis is up and the imaginary axis is down. But we get a circle, right? We just get the tip of that vector as it rotates, draws the circle. Okay, and that kind of makes sense with what we were seeing before. But we're interested in the distance along the real axis. And that distance along the real axis is going to give the instantaneous voltage at any time t. So we throw out the imaginary component, we look at the real component, and we look at that real component over a period of time. And I can take this and I can rotate it. Okay, that real axis is on the vertical and the time axis is on the horizontal. And look, we get our cosine back. Okay, it's got a magnitude of 4, and it has, let's see, it goes through one complete copy of the waveform in 1 second. Okay, and that all looks pretty good. And let's see, if we come down here and we compare it to the original function that I plotted like you would plot any other function, then we're going to see that it lies line on line. Okay, so we can reconstruct any waveform in this way. Okay, now the phase angle, we kind of touched on it, but it might feel a little strange. We're going to shift it some number of degrees to begin with. Okay, so let's take a separate example. Okay, and let's say another example, let's cheat and copy this. Let's copy all of it. Okay, another example. And let's say it has a phase shift, and let's just make it something easy for us to see visually. Let's make it 45 degrees. Okay, the phasor representation is now going to be 4 at an angle of 45 degrees. Okay, so let me change up my code over here so that we have something that looks like that. Looks like that unit is 45. We're going to find out real quick when I plot it. Okay, and let's plot this one. Let's see, here we go. 4 at an angle of 45. Here's the waveform. Okay, plotted in the time domain. I didn't do anything crazy, you know, spinning things around or anything. This is just calculating it for a variety of values of t. And we can see the peak isn't at t equals 0 anymore. It looks like it's back here. Okay, it starts below the peak and it begins going negative. And I want you to think of this in your head a little bit if you can. It's going to, which way is this going to work in the video? I think it's going to work that way. Yep. So it's going to start at 4 at an angle of 45. Okay, so already we're not at the peak. We're a little bit off the peak, right? But it's still positive, and we see that here. And as it begins to spin, it's going to head towards 0 as the tip of my finger gets closer to vertical. Okay, so it starts below the peak and it head towards 0. And we can see that if we take the phasor representation and we go through the same steps that we did a moment ago. There's your time domain plot. Excuse me. And we can think of it as a vector, and this is a vector with a length of 4, and we can see that this angle looks like it's 45 degrees. Okay, so this is the distance that tells us what the voltage is at t equals 0. This phasor is really a snapshot of what's going on at t equals 0. As we let it spin, it's going to decrease to 0. It's going to go down to its negative peak. It's going to come around here. It's going to come back to 0. It's going to go up to its positive peak. And then as it completes one full rotation, we're back to where we started. So it's going to be a little bit below its peak. Okay, so we spin it. We spin it like we did before, right? It spins around and around, and we're taking this distance and we're keeping track of that distance. Okay, just think of it as a point because there's no need to have that line there. And then let it corkscrew up the time axis, right? Just like we did before. And turn on the smoke trail. Okay. And here's our smoke trail. Right? And we can look at the real axis on the vertical and the time axis on the horizontal. Let me see how well I can get this lined up. Come on, snap to where I want you to go. I'm going to cheat. Hold on, I'm going to run a little bit of code here. There it goes. Snap it to where I want. So there's the real axis on the vertical and the time axis on the horizontal. And we can see that it starts below the peak. It heads towards 0. It goes to the negative peak. It comes back to 0. Boo, I dragged my mouse a little. Okay, it goes back to 0. It goes up to its positive peak. And then as we get to 1 second, it's a little bit below the peak again. Okay, so it's completed one full rotation. And if we're being good, and we look at it against the time domain plot, and again, it lines up line on line. Okay, so what I'm hoping I've done in this video is convince you that we can take a cosine and we can represent it as a polar number. And if we think of that polar number as a vector that rotates, we're really redrawing the time domain function that we started with. Okay, so it's a pretty neat thing, and I hope these graphics have helped you. I want to dig into some of the details about how we represent the horizontal scaling, and that's gonna take place in the next video, and then we're gonna look at some important stuff. Okay, the frequency becomes important. So there's a lot more detail to this, but I hope that you're starting to get comfortable with the fact that, hey, that cosine, we can represent it as a complex number. Okay, let's start there and let's keep going. Stay tuned and good luck, folks.